Jesus wept. A quote from the Bible, the shortest sentence, to describe the feelings of many Christians, particularly after the pig's breakfast that Scott Morrison has made with his religious freedom bill. I've got to ask, how did it come to this? Morrison sold this bill as his big legacy. In fact, he reportedly told his cabinet on Monday he was putting his leadership on the line for it. Yet look now, his bill seems not just dead, but the biggest backfire blown up in Morrison's face. He had made a deal to get Labor and many left-wing Liberals to back this bill to ban discrimination against Christians, Muslims and people of other faiths, and to ease really crazy, hysterical, paranoid, and sometimes I think dishonest fears about letting, Christian bigots go around the country being horrible to gay and transgender children, chucking them out of schools. Morrison agreed to amend another law, the Sexual Discrimination Act, to ban discrimination against those children of that kind. The discrimination, I mean. And even then, by the way, no fewer than 5 of his own Liberals still refused to vote for it, which was embarrassing enough. Even so, it did finally get passed through the lower house of Parliament around 4 a.m. today. But then, suddenly, Morrison has said, whoops, no deal after all. No bill for now. That religious freedom bill, now badly watered down, plus the change to the Sexual Discrimination Act, turns out, according to the government, to be worse than useless and probably have terrible unintended consequences that make discrimination even worse. So, what almost all the politicians of the House of Representatives on both sides finally voted for this morning, now we're told it's probably a crock anyway. And by the end, even senators had no idea of what was going on, what they were even voting for, which was in fact nothing at all. No deal after all.
Can we have explained to us what is actually being put to us?
You said that we put the motion. What was that motion?
And so, this bill that was supposed to be Scott Morrison's big legacy, Religious Freedom Bill, is in fact got nothing. Religious groups are angry. 5 Liberals have given him the back of their hand, and made him look a goose. And the government, well, the whole government looks like idiots. Joining me is one of the Liberal senators who very much backed the push for freedom from discrimination for people of faith, Eric Abetz. Senator Eric Abetz, thanks for joining me. Why has the government now parked its bill when the Prime Minister has said this was his signature issue?
The legislation has been so emasculated in the House of Representatives that to pass it up to the Senate would have been to repudiate that which we had promised to the Australian people, and that was genuine religious freedom legislation. And what the Labor Party did to it meant that it no longer represented that which we had promised. And therefore I think it was the right decision by the Prime Minister.
But it was shepherded to a vote in the early hours of this morning. The government thought at that stage it was worth voting on. At what stage did it think, well, actually, this might backfire, this might actually be worse than the situation as is?
Well, as soon as I heard about Labor amendments late yesterday, I thought that that was a likely scenario, but as the House of Representatives was going through this in the very early hours, I confess I was sending up Zs, sleeping, because as a senator I didn't need to be following it, but what I woke up to this morning was a complete schmozzle. And I've got to say, whilst we have the right of Liberals to cross the floor and make decisions contrary to the party room, that is a freedom we have in our party. If the Labor Party didn't have such an iron discipline, which is expulsion for crossing the floor, I'm sure there would have been quite a few Labor people who would have voted with the government, and then the legislation in its original form could have proceeded. But that is not the want of the Labor Party. As a result, they were able to enforce these amendments which made the bill completely unacceptable.
Tell me if I'm hearing you right, Eric. Are you suggesting that all right, the government got this thing through, I think it was like 4 a.m. in the morning in the lower house, then when senators like you are really passionate about this bill, had a look at it, your pushback, the government suddenly had no more support for it from people that mattered in the vote, in its own party.
The amendments were just so atrocious, and might I add, this legislation had its genesis in the same-sex marriage debate, where both Liberal and Labor promised that if same-sex marriage got through, religious freedom would be legislated and protected. And we as a government have sought to deliver on that, but Mr Albanese has tried to wedge the government by moving amendments that he must have known would have been unacceptable to the government to try to stop Mr Morrison from achieving
but my point is they weren't unacceptable to the government this morning. But what I'm asking is, was it unacceptable to a number of Liberal senators in the afternoon? Is that why it's sort of died?
I'm not aware of what occurred in the leadership and as to why it wasn't progressing to the Senate, but the form that it was in when it ended in the House of Representatives was in such a form that, in fact, I think Australia would have been better off and Australian faith communities would have been better off without any legislation.
Eric Abetz, the Prime Minister, we're told, in The Australian, was so desperate to get this bill through, this is his big bill, that he suggested in a cabinet meeting on Monday that he might promise Tasmanian Liberal MP Bridget Archer to back, if she would back his bill, because she was threatened to cross the floor, he would promise to finally agree to a push for a National Integrity Commission. I mean, it's a crazy horse trading, and his cabinet stopped him, pointing out correctly that that would just make him look sneaky. Isn't this whole thing the most amazing, embarrassing backflip? I mean, it's just makes the government look stupid, doesn't it?
Well, this is speculation by Peter Van Onselen. I'm not in Cabinet these days, so I'm not able to either verify or otherwise that speculation. But my own view is, in relation to legislation, that you should treat each bit of legislation on its merits. And when you start engaging in horse trading and accepting bad legislation in an attempt to get some good legislation through, you do a great disservice to the Australian people, and every piece of legislation should be judged on its own merits.
Is this the last straw for Scott Morrison? Is it time to think about new leadership?
Look, Scott Morrison clearly has the confidence of the party room, and my prediction is that he'll lead us to the next election. I don't think that's a brave prediction, and ultimately the Australian people will need to decide whether they want Scott Morrison and the Liberals delivering government or Anthony Albanese. And what I would say to the Australian people who might be harbouring doubts, as the opinion polls would suggest, be very careful of jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, and I think that will be on the Australian people's minds as we get closer to the election.
Eric Abetz, I know how much this religious freedom bill meant to you. I feel sorry for you that it's now turned to ashes, but thank you so much indeed for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and yes, it is disappointing.